So now, this is with my greatest pleasure, I would like to introduce you to Vincent Bakker. Vincent has over 12 years experience in energy investment. Starting his career at Royal Dutch Shell, he worked in Netherlands, Kazakhstan, and Singapore in large M&A, complex capital projects, and government negotiations. He has co-founded Asia First Renewable and Energy Investment Platform. He heads the finance function at Entoria Energy, an international renewable energy developer. He regularly speaks at industry events and mentors renewable energy startups. Vincent will discuss the following topics: the RRR challenge. Can renewables be profitable with ever lower prices? Increase the panel prices, yet ever lower power auction are eating away at profits. Where will the yield improvement in solar come from? And last but not least, renewable project economics, drivers, and where the yield improvements will come from. We look forward to your presentation, and Vincent, please, I will let you to take over from here. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Oksana. Let me do the usual. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see.
Yes, we can.
Yes,
okay.
We can.
Perfect. All right, so today I will talk a bit about the return challenge that renewable energy is facing and how can we preserve yield in what is quite a challenging landscape and a changing landscape. So a bit about myself. I'll skip it because Oksana already did a great introduction. I started my career in Shell, did penance for my sins in dirty oil and gas by moving to Positive Energy, a startup that I co-founded to basically, to some extent, try to do what you're trying to do here, bridge the gap between renewable energy projects and capital. Currently, I'm leading the finance function at Entoria Energy. We're active in Latin America, Spain, and Southeast Asia. Entoria Energy is headquartered in Singapore, so Kiran, we're probably very close, we're very close by. We're a privately held developer, an investor and operator of renewables, and we do both small scale and large scale. So I don't agree with Kiran's statement that small scale is not scalable and not help, because I believe it's the easy small bits that we can easily do. What are we going to discuss today? I will not discuss any technology because I think that's been very well covered by other speakers. In fact, I'll focus a bit on the economics of renewables and the current recent challenges and the new opportunities. I won't make this into much of a number presentation, but more discuss some trends that I see both on the downward and the upside side of renewables. The last decade has been a decade of growth in renewables. I would say that up to 2010, renewables was a side business. It was called alternative energies. It was not mainstream. It was not seen as serious. It was seen as expensive. It was nice to have. It was cute. And it was reflected in the cost. If you look at the average power generation cost for a unit of electricity in China, you can see that the cost for both utility PV as well as wind, the two biggest sources of renewable energy, was absolutely off the chart and completely uncompetitive versus coal and gas. Now, the major change that has been made in the landscape, as everybody on this call is probably aware, is how the cost of electricity, of generating a unit of electricity, has dropped by almost 75 or 80% to, and this is a very important point, below the cost of solar. Whoever doesn't know this study, I would recommend you to download this immediately. Lazard is an investment bank that every year publishes a comparison of the cost of generating a unit of electricity. So it looks at a project life cycle and what would it cost over the entire life cycle per unit of electricity. This graph is important because solar PV and wind energy has over the last decade made an enormous shift. And what you see today is if you look at the cost of coal, which of course varies heavily, is it an old or a new coal-powered plant, what's the carbon tax, etc., you'll see something very important. You will see it in all the circumstances, utility scale solar PV is cheaper than coal. And in most cases, a medium-sized solar PV, and in all cases wind, is cheaper than coal. In other words, it makes very little sense nowadays to build a coal power plant when you can do renewables. Now the little diamond is also a very interesting one and has recently been added. This is the marginal cost of a unit of electricity. In other words, I already have my coal power plant. Do I switch it on or not? Do I buy the fuel? Well, increasingly, the answer is no, because wind is cheaper on a marginal cost basis. In other words, I might as well shut down my existing coal power plant and build new renewable energy, wind or solar, for existing demand. Now, this will further help, of course, the involvement of renewables. That's why renewables is big. The global investment in billions of US dollars of renewables has been increasing increasingly, and has six-folded over the last decade, whereas the investment in oil and gas in its peak of $140 per barrel has gradually been in decline and is not really showing a lot of recovery. Another thing about renewables is that it's leading in Asia, whereas Asia before was a bit of a traditional, with a lot of emerging countries, a lot of cost-focused market. What we see nowadays is that Asia is actually taking the predominant investments in renewables. You can see it in the returns. Renewable returns have tripled over fossil fuels in the last decade. Renewables is simply becoming a good investment. But a few things have not changed. It's still not as easy to do renewables. First of all, it remains long-term investment, and even more than oil and gas. Oil and gas requires energy to run, a lot of staff, expensive staff, a lot of maintenance and cleaning and turnarounds. That is not the case for renewables, which actually means that renewables is way more exposed to this huge upfront investment that you need to make. 95% of the lifetime costs of a renewable energy farm are upfront. And the payback period is 7 to 8 years. That's very long for a lot of companies. And with a lifetime of 20 to 25 years, a lot can happen. The other thing that didn't really change yet is the financing challenges. It's still not very easy to finance renewable projects. And I think the first speaker, Mr. Begley, has very clearly stated that. VCs, they want tech, they want AI, they want hip stuff, they want e-commerce. They don't want renewables because it's too small, it's too new. Traditional investors, the infrastructure investors, they like oil and gas. Huge mega projects, one big check and get done with it. The regulatory framework is catching up but is underdeveloped, so there's a lot of investor uncertainty. And the problem with renewables, there is still more downside risk than upside risk. Now let me explain that a bit. If I install a solar farm, the sun is not suddenly going to shine more. It's very unlikely. The weather is predictable within a certain range. But my customer can go bankrupt. My panels can break down. My grid can collapse. All sorts of negative things can happen. In other words, it's still a pioneering industry. What are some other challenges that we face in renewables? Well, the revenue is falling and falling and falling. Renewables is going from a very much a subsidized model to a free market model. As renewables get more competitive, we see financial support structures are eliminated. The traditional renewable market is heavily reliant on subsidies. Between 2010 and 2016, you would get 10 to 88 cents of kilowatt hour of subsidy in the US. Well, that's not needed anymore because renewables are competitive, so governments are cutting these subsidies. Feed-in tariffs was the next phase. We don't need to subsidize if you just promise renewable energy projects a guaranteed source of revenue. It's a step down from subsidies, but it's still good. I get a fixed rate, I know what I'm at. Japan has been paying a feed-in tariff of 40 cents US for a while, is now down to 20. Vietnam has delivered an enormous amount of renewable energy, solar predominantly, at 8.5 cents. So the feed-in tariffs have reduced. Even the feed-in tariffs are gone. Nowadays, PPAs are auctioned. Governments don't promise fixed rates anymore because they don't need to. There's so many people competing for the same market share. So we see PPA auctions of 50 euro per megawatt hour in Germany and sometimes even lower. We see renewables going into a race to the bottom. In a pursuit of market share, in Saudi Arabia, people have bid 1 point something cents USD. In other words, the prices of the revenue that renewable energy projects can command, and this is a bit more for solar than for wind, have fallen significantly. So, because it's naturally a competitive energy source, to some extent government support is not needed. But at the same time, large developers are racing to the bottom for market share. Hence, dwindling returns, dwindling revenues. At the same time, as revenues decline, costs have gone up. Costs may have decreased enormously over the last decade, but renewables is not immune to supply issues. Remember that renewables is still actually a very resource heavy activity, because 95 of your lifetime cost is this upfront investment in installing this equipment. That means renewables is very sensitive to costs. So a modest capex increase, a modest revenue movement is immediately killing project returns. And solar module prices have already surged 35% in this year. That has a huge impact. And what about my offtake? Can I actually sell my electricity? Well, here we see another problem in developing markets. The uncontrolled addition of renewables has naturally led to misbalanced demand and supply. If I keep pushing renewables on the grid, there will be a point in which there's simply no demand. Is that in the remote future? For some economies, like Indonesia, as mentioned before, maybe it is, but this is already the reality. If we look into Australia, you can see that in Q3 2021, in one state, 25% of the times there was a negative price. Now, think about this for a moment. In 25% of the times during the day, I cannot sell my electricity, but I actually need to pay money to get rid of my electricity, and somebody is getting paid to consume electricity. The effect of this is reduced prices for new projects, because why would I pay? The prices are negative. The grid stability is also leading to increased grid costs for all players, and governments will be less keen to support if the market is getting saturated. And those projects that are actually exposed to the spot market, the renewable energy projects that have not been able to secure long-term revenues, long-term contracts, they are very much exposed. So, conclusions on the current renewable market. The market has changed profoundly. It went from a pioneering niche industry to that was kind of following the market. It has lived to the cost and power markets being driven by renewables, if more anything around. And the regulatory framework is catching up. As a result, the traditional plain vanilla utilities have less and less purpose. The traditional, I put down a wind farm and I feed it to the grid and I see what else happens. Because who will sign a long-term PPA if there's sufficient spot supply? Who needs solar power during the day when power is free at noon? And competition in mega projects has reduced the margin in utility solar, onshore and wind. There's more pressure. Investors are increasingly critical on off-takers, grid and ESG components. As this becomes a free market study, investors will actually look, who are you selling the power to? Because you can't just trust that the government will buy it. A good question today is, can you have a good environmental project but a socially poor project? Well, yes, you can. A lot of, and I think Mr. Begley in the first presentation alluded to that, a lot of the initial solar tenders were fraught with corruption. Investors are taking note, they have higher standards. In other words, the saturation of the current system, and I'm saying the current system, is in sight for many major markets. However, there are opportunities. First of all, renewables has an unfair advantage over fossil fuels. Decarbonization is here. Investors are shunning or demanding the high returns in oil and gas. Investors don't want oil and gas anymore. Pension funds, banks, they all eliminate coal lending. They're dumping their oil and gas returns. Any green investment is commanding a premium. So on top of that favoritism, the commodity volatility, commodity prices have gone up and down. That actually shows the benefit of the stable renewable energy contracts over these volatile oil and gas markets. So renewable as an investment product has changed. If people think that oil and gas is risky, they will require higher returns. They will charge higher interest prices. They will not be willing to lend as much. That means that oil and gas will require higher break-even prices, and as a result, renewables will automatically become more competitive with doing nothing. Renewables is seen as safer. That means they can get lower interest rate. That means you need a lower project IRR or get a higher equity IRR. So without doing anything else, the unfair advantage over fossil fuels is already boosting the returns in renewables. Renewable investment qualities will reduce the need for investment quantity, and sub-economic projects that are almost there but not good enough will, because of these tailwinds, will be pushed over the line. The second opportunity is carbon prices. Carbon market, tax, renewable energy products, all of these things give basically free revenues to renewables, but at the same time they punish fossil fuels. Now, many countries have already carbon markets and taxes, and COP27 has actually strengthened that. Maybe not as much as we want, but it's there. The global carbon market is already $270 billion annually, and if a carbon tax of 50 USD per ton is imposed and as a result realized or offset by renewables, this can boost the renewable IRR by 20%. So my prediction is that carbon and REC, they're somewhat related, will become an increasing value driver and optimizer for renewables and also further enable sub-economic projects. What's the next frontier for renewables? In the current markets, a boost because oil and gas is less interesting. In emerging markets, there's also a lot of opportunities because renewables can replace the next part of fossil fuels. We've been talking a lot about renewables and solar and all sorts of stuff. It basically is only replacing electricity, current electricity. But there's more. A lot of places in the world are still running on diesel. There's islands in Indonesia that have gigawatts of diesel-powered power stations. That is much more carbon intensive and even more inefficient. There's mining fields, oil and gas, plantations, remote locations, they all run on diesel. There's diesel generators for households in Africa and Latin America. They're very inefficient, and mind you, these consumers can pay for diesel. They have purchasing power for solar. There's a credit risk concentration to address, but there's a huge opportunity. Heating. Buildings, heatings, industrial process is 50% of global power consumption. We're talking about electricity, but heating is the big polluter. Now, it requires a bit of technological innovation for heat and supply stability, but if renewables can provide heating, that will be the next frontier for return. And transportation. The more we do electric driving, the more electricity we need, and the more green hydrogen we need, that also means the more electricity we need. In other words, there's an enormous opportunities if we look beyond current electricity markets to provide power, to provide the energy, to replace diesel, to replace fossil fuels for heating, and to replace fossil fuels for transport. And that is an opportunity in itself 4 times bigger than just electricity. The other part where renewables will play a role and will win is more integrated solutions. Where Kiran has more of an integrated ESG approach, and I'm not going to contradict anything he says, except of course the focus on big projects. I think there's also a lot of opportunities for a more economic integrated solutions. Plain utility projects, grid connected solar, they compete with the generation cost. They compete with the cost of generation from a coal power plant. But behind the meter, solar panel on your roof actually competes with delivered costs, which includes generation, margins, grid charges, and is hence much more economic. Integrated solutions also means that renewables should be augmented with savings. Electricity not consumed is still cheaper than renewables. Finally, with an increase in renewable energy supply, there will also be an increase in demand and other sources of electrification. Prosumer model will increase, where people both buy and consume power. Smart grids, smart appliances, your car can charge where there's abundant solar and will stop charging when there's clouds, and economic storage. In other words, another next frontier for renewables is integrated service providers that will be able to capture margin along the supply chain and optimize between those models. And excellent asset management and maintenance can also boost returns. So my conclusions about the renewable energy projects. First of all, the renewable energy success has actually reduced the need for simple utility PPA. That model, except for new markets, is going to die out. Secondly, decarbonization will continue to enable stranded projects. The IRR might not go up for your renewable energy project, but the hurdles will go down and the requirements for oil and debt will go up. And investors will continue to pour more and more money into renewables. In other words, the next generation of renewable energy projects and companies are those that dare to venture far, are able to replace more than just electricity demand, can integrate closer to the customer, and can deliver more solid projects than in the past from a legal, commercial, technical, and ESG perspective. Thank you.
Fantastic, great timing, Vincent. So thank you for your wonderful presentation. I appreciate that you also have join us, and you're also in Singapore, right?
Correct, yes.
Yes, so it's a deep night for you as well. So I appreciate for you making effort. So now we have received an interesting question from the audience. So all kilowatts are not the same. A kilowatt of solar during 5 peak sun hours are not the same as a 5 kilowatt at peak time outside of sun hours and at nights, right? So a CCGT 24/7 can't be compared with solar kilowatt 5 hours a day, right?
No, you're absolutely right. Yes and no. So I think in a system where there is in a developed power system, it's very easy to put more solar on the grid and turn the coal power plants a bit lower. That's a very simple thing to do, and that will something that will happen regardless. Similarly, in emerging economies where there's an increase in power supply, an increase in power demand, it's very easy to meet that new demand during the peak with solar and more and more and more. But at a certain moment, you reach a limit. You're absolutely right. And there we need to make a choice. Because if we say we're turning down all these coal power plants, okay, that's fine. We rely on renewables during the day. That means that part short time in the evening, when everybody goes home and turns on the heating, we will rely more and more and more on natural gas. So we should look into the entire power system. How are we really decarbonizing?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, Vincent, I have few more wonderful questions, but I want to keep in mind our timing that we are a little bit behind the schedule. So thank you so much. I'll let you kind of rest for the night. I presume it's like already past midnight there where you are, right? Or
That's correct.
so?
That's correct. But
Yes.
always a pleasure to talk to you and to
Thank
give
you
my
so
views with a wider audience. Thank you very much, Oksana.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I really appreciate it.